The afternoon session at the Jefferson County Courthouse had turned the solemn judicial chamber into a war zone of shouting voices and gunfire. Masked men with automatic weapons lined the exits like sentries, their leader holding a gun to the judge's head. Luxury suits and legal robes cowered beneath polished oak tables, terrified eyes watching as the chaos unfolded. Everyone was paralyzed with fear, everyone desperate to survive, everyone except the steady woman kneeling with zip-tied hands, who observed the gunman with an almost supernatural precision that they had failed to notice. They saw an unremarkable stenographer, a forgettable court employee who blended into the background. They had no idea they were threatening one of the United States Air Force's most decorated combat pilots. Rachel Coleman, 32 years old, assessed the hostage situation with the same systematic calculation she'd once used to fly F-16 Fighting Falcons through hostile airspace over Afghanistan. Her auburn hair was regulation neat despite the chaos, her blue eyes constantly scanning exits and threats with the situational awareness of someone trained to detect dangers at supersonic speeds. She wore the standard stenographer's attire with quiet anonymity, treating her position in the courtroom like the cockpit it was to her, a station whose proper operation meant the difference between delivering justice intact or facing catastrophic failure. The silver pilot wings tattooed over her heart, hidden beneath her professional blazer, marked her as one of the few women qualified for combat aviation, someone whose call sign Phantom had become legendary among Air Force squadrons. The courthouse was supposed to be her peaceful transition from military service, a place where she could bring order without facing danger. But today, that careful balance between her warrior past and civilian present was about to be shattered when the gunman grabbed her by the blazer, tearing the fabric to reveal everything she had tried to hide. For more powerful videos about our military heroes, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue to tell these important stories. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of Courtroom 307, casting long rectangles of brightness across the polished oak floors and gleaming mahogany furnishings. The Jefferson County Courthouse was an imposing structure, all marble columns and echoing hallways that spoke of authority and tradition. Inside Courtroom 307, the day's proceedings were about to begin. In the corner, partially obscured by her stenography machine, sat Rachel Coleman, 32, her auburn hair swept into a neat bun that complemented her slim-fitting navy blazer and crisp white blouse. Her blue eyes remained downcast, focused on the keys beneath her fingers, rarely meeting those of anyone else in the room. To the judges, lawyers, defendants, and spectators who passed through these doors daily, she was simply the court reporter, a near-invisible presence whose only purpose was to record their words. Most never bothered to look closely enough to notice the perfect posture she maintained hour after hour, or the way her eyes constantly scanned the room in subtle sweeps. No one recognized the disciplined economy of her movements, nothing wasted, nothing excessive. If they had, they might have realized these weren't the habits of someone who had spent her life behind a stenography machine, but of someone trained to operate in environments where precision meant survival. Rachel arrived at the courthouse 45 minutes before proceedings began each day, a habit from her military days when on time meant 15 minutes early. She'd park her modest sedan in the same spot in the courthouse garage, walk the same route through security, nodding to the same guards who barely acknowledged her presence. She preferred it that way, to be a ghost, unnoticed, unremarkable. This morning had been no different. She'd settled at her station, arranging her equipment with methodical care. Her stenotype machine was her instrument now, not the complex flight controls of an F-16. It was simpler, yes, but required its own kind of precision. Her fingers had long ago memorized its layout, just as they had once known every switch and button in a fighter jet's cockpit. Before her 4 years as a court stenographer, Rachel Coleman had been Captain Rachel Coleman, F-16 fighter pilot, United States Air Force. With over 2,000 flight hours and 3 combat tours, she had once sliced through the skies at supersonic speeds, made split-second decisions under enemy fire, and executed maneuvers that pushed the limits of human endurance. The hands that now quietly recorded testimony had once controlled aircraft worth tens of millions of dollars through combat zones. Her path to the cockpit hadn't been easy. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, Rachel had always looked skyward, fascinated by the planes that occasionally passed overhead. Her father, a high school science teacher, had encouraged her interest, taking her to air shows whenever they could afford it. Her mother, though supportive, had worried about her daughter's dreams, not because she didn't believe Rachel could achieve them, but because she knew how hard the world could be on women who dared to enter male-dominated spaces. Rachel had proven exceptional from the start. She graduated with honors from the Air Force Academy, outperforming many of her male classmates in both academics and physical training. When it came time for assignments, She had fought hard for a fighter pilot slot, refusing to be relegated to transport or support roles that were traditionally more open to women. Her determination had paid off, and she'd earned her wings with a specialization in the F-16 Fighting Falcon, the sleek, agile fighter jet that would become her office for the next decade. Her call sign, Phantom, had been earned during a training exercise when she had managed to approach the instructor's aircraft undetected, executing a perfect mock kill before disappearing again. Like a damn ghost, the frustrated instructor had commented. The name had stuck, and it had suited her. Rachel had always been comfortable with invisibility when it served her purpose. For years, she had thrived in the high-stakes world of combat aviation. She'd flown missions over Afghanistan and Iraq, providing close air support for ground troops, conducting reconnaissance and engaging enemy aircraft. The sky had been her domain, a place where gender mattered less than skill, where her worth was measured by her ability to complete the mission and bring herself and her aircraft home safely. But everything had changed on a clear day at Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan. Rachel had been preparing for a routine patrol mission, conducting her pre-flight checks with the same thoroughness she always did. Lieutenant Mark Daniels and Captain Sarah Williams, fellow pilots from her squadron, had been nearby, bantering about a poker game from the night before. The first explosion had come without warning, a mortar attack on the airfield. Rachel had reacted instinctively, shouting for everyone to take cover. The second explosion had been closer, much closer. Later she would learn that insurgents had managed to infiltrate the base perimeter and plant IEDs near the aircraft. The blast had thrown her several feet, shrapnel tearing through her flight suit and into her chest and shoulder. Through the ringing in her ears she had heard screaming, had seen flames engulfing one of the nearby jets, Lieutenant Daniels' aircraft. Despite her injury, she had dragged herself toward it, toward the figure still moving inside the cockpit. What followed had been a blur of pain, smoke, and desperate efforts. She had managed to reach Daniels to pull him from the burning wreckage, but it had been too late. He had died in her arms. His flight suit melted into his skin. Captain Williams had been killed instantly by the initial blast. Rachel had spent months in hospitals, first at the military medical facility in Germany, then at Walter Reed in the United States. The physical wounds had healed slowly. Shrapnel had been removed from her chest and shoulder, leaving scars that would never fade. Her left eardrum had been damaged, resulting in permanent hearing loss. 3 ribs had been broken, 1 puncturing her lung. The psychological wounds had been slower to heal, if they ever truly had. Survivor's guilt had haunted her recovery. Why had she lived when Daniels and Williams had died? What could she have done differently? The nightmares had been relentless. Flames, screams, the weight of Daniels' body in her arms as life left him. The Air Force had awarded her medals for her actions that day, a Purple Heart for her injuries, a Bronze Star with Valor for her attempt to save Daniels despite her own wounds. They had offered her a position as a flight instructor once she recovered, recognizing that her combat days were likely over due to her injuries. But Rachel had known she couldn't do it, couldn't spend her days in simulators and classrooms, teaching others to fly when she herself would never again feel the freedom of the open sky, the adrenaline of combat, the perfect harmony between pilot and machine. So she had left, accepting a medical discharge with honors, her service record impeccable. The transition to civilian life had been harder than she'd anticipated. The structured, purpose-driven world of the military had been replaced by a bewildering array of choices and a profound sense of aimlessness. What did one do after commanding the skies? She had tried various jobs, corporate positions that had valued her leadership experience, security consultations that had drawn on her tactical knowledge, but none had felt right. The corporate world had been too political, too focused on appearance rather than substance. Security work had brought back too many memories, too many triggers. Court reporting had come as a suggestion from her VA counselor, who had noted Rachel's attention to detail and ability to remain focused for long periods. "It's structured," the counselor had said, "orderly, and you'd be serving the justice system, which might give you some of that sense of purpose you're missing." Rachel had been skeptical but willing to try. The training had been rigorous in its own way, mastering the stenotype machine, learning legal terminology, understanding court procedures. To her surprise, she had found a certain peace in the work. Here, chaos was contained within the strict procedures of law. Here, she could be anonymous, unremarkable, just another cog in the machinery of justice. The last thing she wanted was for people to look at her and see wounded veteran, or female pilot, or any of the other labels that had followed her throughout her military career. Here she was just Rachel, the court reporter, and that simplicity had become her sanctuary. Today's case was a high-profile drug trafficking trial that had drawn significant media attention. The defendant, Martin Reeves, sat at the defense table in an expensive suit that couldn't quite hide the hardness in his eyes. Behind him, filling the first 2 rows of spectator seating, were men with similar expressions, members of his organization, there to intimidate witnesses and show support for their leader. Rachel had been recording this trial for 3 weeks now. She knew the details of Reeves's operation better than anyone except perhaps the prosecutor. How his network had moved millions in cocaine and heroin through the city. How the violence associated with his business had left 12 people dead in the past 2 years. How he had corrupted 2 police officers who were now serving prison terms themselves. She had watched as witness after witness took the stand, some brave, some terrified, all contributing to the mounting evidence against Reeves. Today was supposed to be the testimony of a former associate who had turned state's evidence in exchange for leniency, a key witness whose inside knowledge could seal Reeves' fate. Judge Sandra Wilson presided, her gray hair and stern demeanor commanding respect from most who entered her courtroom. In the 3 years Rachel had worked in her courtroom, she had come to appreciate the judge's no-nonsense approach and commitment to procedural fairness. Wilson was tough but even-handed, unswayed by emotion or intimidation. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney James Chen, was reviewing his notes at his table while the defense attorney, an expensive hire from a prestigious firm, whispered with his client. Chen was young but sharp, his case against Reeves meticulously constructed. Rachel had noticed his tendency to tap his pen 3 times before making an important point, a tell she doubted he was aware of. Rachel's fingers moved automatically across her stenography machine, recording the procedural opening of court. Her mind, however, was noting other details, the unusual number of Reeves's associates present today, the way they kept checking their phones despite the court's rules, the palpable tension in the air. Something felt off, but Rachel kept her observations to herself. It wasn't her place to intervene. She was just there to record. The morning progressed with testimony from a police detective about evidence seized during a raid on one of Reeves' warehouses. Detective Michael Rodriguez detailed the discovery of cocaine with a street value of over $2 million, along with weapons and documents that linked the operation directly to Reeves. "And were you able to determine the origin of these narcotics?" ADA Chen asked, tapping his pen 3 times against his legal pad. "Yes, sir," Rodriguez replied. "Based on packaging methods and chemical analysis, we traced it to a cartel operating out of Central America, specifically Honduras." "And did you find evidence linking the defendant, Martin Reeves, to these drugs?" "We did. There were ledgers containing coded entries that our analysts were able to decode. Mr. Reeves' fingerprints were found on these ledgers, as well as on several of the packages containing cocaine." The defense attorney, Lawrence Bennett, objected repeatedly, challenging the chain of custody for the evidence, the methods used for fingerprint analysis, and the qualifications of the analysts who had decoded the ledgers. Judge Wilson overruled most of his objections but sustained a few, maintaining the careful balance of the proceedings. Throughout it all, Rachel's fingers danced across her machine, capturing every word, every objection, every ruling. Her face remained neutral, her presence unremarkable, exactly as she preferred. During the mid-morning break, Rachel remained at her station, reviewing her notes while others filed out. Judge Wilson had already retreated to her chambers, and the attorneys were conferring in the hallway. Only a bailiff, an elderly court clerk, and a handful of spectators remained in the courtroom, along with several of Reeves's associates. The clerk, Harold Jenkins, had worked at the courthouse for over 30 years. He often brought Rachel coffee during breaks, one of the few people who seemed to actually see her. Today he approached with his usual offering, a small cup of black coffee, no sugar. "Thought you might need this," he said quietly, placing it beside her machine. "Feels like it's going to be a long day." Rachel offered a small smile. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins." She had learned that small kindnesses like his were rare and worth acknowledging. Jenkins lingered for a moment, his eyes drifting to the spectator section where Reeves' men sat in clusters, talking in low voices. "Don't like the feel of this one," he murmured. "Too many of them here today." Rachel nodded slightly, having had the same thought. "The marshal's office has extra security in the building," she said, knowing this because she had noticed the additional uniformed officers in the hallways that morning. "Still," Jenkins sighed, "I'll be glad when this trial is over." As he shuffled back to his desk, Rachel sipped the coffee, her eyes continuing their subtle surveillance of the room. One of Reeves's associates, a heavily tattooed man with a shaved head, was watching the bailiff with particular intensity. Another kept glancing at his watch. A third had positioned himself near the side door that led to the judge's chambers. Rachel had spent enough time in combat zones to recognize the signs of an impending operation. Her muscles tensed slightly, her senses heightening as they had done countless times when flying into hostile territory. But what could she do? She was just the court reporter. Any concerns she raised would likely be dismissed, especially without concrete evidence. So she waited, watched, and prepared. For what? She wasn't yet sure. The court reconvened at 11:15 a.m. Judge Wilson returned to the bench, the attorneys to their tables, and the spectators to their seats. The witness chair remained empty, awaiting the return of Detective Rodriguez. The court calls Detective Michael Rodriguez to continue his testimony, Judge Wilson announced. The doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly burst open. 3 men in black clothing and ski masks rushed in, brandishing handguns. "Everybody down now," one of them shouted. The bailiff reached for his weapon, but one of the intruders fired a shot into the ceiling. The deafening crack echoed through the courtroom, sending plaster dust raining down. "Next one goes in your head," the gunman warned, aiming directly at the bailiff, who slowly raised his hands and knelt down. Rachel remained perfectly still, her breathing controlled despite the adrenaline now flooding her system. This wasn't her first time under fire. Her mind automatically shifted into the same state of hyper-awareness she had relied on during missions, assessing threats, calculating options, waiting for the right moment. 3 armed intruders. One at the main entrance, one approaching the bench, one moving toward Reeves. Semi-automatic handguns, likely 9mm based on the sound of the shot. No visible body armor. No clear exit strategy yet. Approximately 15 civilians in the room. Judge, attorneys, clerk, bailiff, and spectators. Probability of additional accomplices outside. Time until police response, perhaps 2 to 3 minutes given the courthouse security. These calculations flashed through Rachel's mind in seconds, as automatic as breathing. She had run similar tactical assessments countless times, before missions, during unexpected enemy contact, in the chaotic moments after the IED explosion at Bagrama. The tallest of the masked men approached the defendant, Martin Reeves. "Time to go, boss," he said, confirming what Rachel had already suspected. This was a planned escape attempt. Reeves stood, shedding his pretense of innocence like an ill-fitting coat. "About damn time," he muttered, revealing a very different demeanor than the respectful defendant he had portrayed during the trial. As 2 of the gunmen covered the room, the third began zip-tying the hands of the bailiff and the few spectators present. When he approached Rachel, she kept her eyes downcast, appearing terrified like everyone else. "Hands where I can see them," he ordered, his voice muffled by the mask. Rachel complied, raising her hands slowly, allowing herself to appear small, harmless, just another frightened court employee. The man roughly secured the zip tie around her wrists, not realizing she was subtly flexing her wrists and tensing her muscles to create space within the bonds, an old trick she had learned during survival training. Judge Wilson was being zip-tied next, her face a mixture of anger and fear. "You won't get away with this," she said, her judicial authority momentarily forgotten in the face of raw fear. "Already have," replied the gunman, securing her hands. "Now shut up." Rachel's eyes continued their careful assessment. The emergency exit at the far side of the courtroom was blocked by several of Reeves's associates who had drawn their own weapons once the attack began. They had been part of the plan all along. The main entrance was covered by one of the masked gunmen. The side door to the judge's chambers was now being guarded by another associate. "Well planned," Rachel acknowledged silently. "Multiple armed men, control of all exits, coordination between the masked intruders and the planted associates." This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment attempt. It had been carefully orchestrated. The lead gunman was now on his phone. "We've got him, heading to the east stairwell in 2 minutes. He looked around the room, then pointed at Rachel. "Bring her. We need a hostage until we're clear." The man who had zip-tied her grabbed Rachel by her blazer, yanking her to her feet. "Let's go, sweetheart. Don't make this difficult." The sudden force caused the seam along her shoulder to tear, the delicate fabric giving way with a distinct ripping sound. As he pulled her forward, the tear widened, exposing her upper chest and shoulder. The room went silent. Where there should have been smooth skin, there was instead a detailed tattoo of Air Force pilots' wings, inked proudly over her heart. Beside it, partially visible, were jagged scars from shrapnel wounds, a roadmap of violence and survival etched into her flesh. And below those, peeking from beneath her white blouse, was the edge of another tattoo, the tail number of her F-16, a memorial to the aircraft she had lost. The gunman's grip loosened in surprise. "What the?" Rachel moved. In one fluid motion, honed through thousands of hours of training, she snapped the zip tie binding her wrists, grabbed the gunman's wrist, and twisted with precise pressure on nerve points that sent shooting pain up his arm. The gun clattered to the floor, Before he could react, she drove her elbow into his solar plexus with exactly the right force at exactly the right angle, following with a strike to his throat that left him gasping on the floor. The second gunman turned, weapon raising, but Rachel was already moving. She slid across the polished floor, snatched the fallen gun, and fired a single shot with the precision of someone who had qualified as an expert marksman year after year. The bullet struck his hand, sending his weapon spinning away as he howled in pain. One of Reeves's associates near the emergency exit raised his weapon, taking aim at Rachel. She rolled behind the solid oak witness stand just as bullets splintered the wood where she had been a split second before. Without hesitating, she popped up from the other side and fired twice, one shot hitting the man's shoulder, the other his knee, dropping him to the ground. The lead gunman, standing near Reeves, swung his weapon toward her. "Don't move or I'll—" Rachel didn't give him time to finish. She dove behind the solid oak bench, bullets splintering wood where she had been a heartbeat before. The elderly clerk and remaining spectators were huddled beneath tables, eyes wide with shock at the transformation they were witnessing. "Everyone stay down," Rachel commanded, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of authority, not the quiet court stenographer they knew, but the voice of a captain who had led men and women into combat. The courtroom had become a battlefield, and Captain Rachel Coleman was back in her element. She calculated angles, distances, risks. Just as she had done in the cockpit, the lead gunman was using Reeves as a shield, backing toward the door. The second gunman was cradling his wounded hand but still posed a threat. The third was still on the floor, struggling for breath after her throat strike. 4 of Reeves's associates were still armed. 1 down with shoulder and knee wounds, 3 still actively threatening. "You don't know who you're dealing with," the lead gunman shouted, his voice betraying nervousness that hadn't been there before. Rachel's laugh was short and without humor. "Neither do you." She moved again, this time in a different direction, drawing his fire while advancing in a flanking maneuver that any combat veteran would recognize. A bullet grazed her arm, tearing through the sleeve of her blazer and drawing a thin line of blood. But she didn't flinch. Pain was an old acquaintance. With a series of movements too fast for untrained eyes to follow, Rachel disabled the wounded gunman with a kick that sent him sprawling, then focused on the leader, who now held his gun against Reeves' head. "I'll kill him," he threatened. "You might," Rachel acknowledged, her voice calm as she kept her weapon trained on him. "But you won't leave this room alive if you do." From her position, she could see 2 of Reeves' armed associates trying to edge toward her from different angles. Without taking her eyes off the leader, she fired 2 precise shots, one that sent an associate's weapon skittering across the floor, another that forced the second man to dive for cover. The lead gunman's eyes darted between Rachel and the door, calculating his dwindling options. What had seemed like a straightforward prison break had transformed into a standoff with a woman who moved like no court stenographer he'd ever seen. Rachel stood tall now, her torn blazer revealing more of the scars and tattoos that told the story of her past. Her blue eyes were cold, focused, the eyes of someone who had made life-or-death decisions under far worse circumstances than this. 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, she said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. Over 2,000 flight hours in an F-16, qualified expert in 3 weapon systems. Her smile was sharp as glass, and you thought you'd found an easy hostage. The gunman's resolve visibly wavered. In that moment of hesitation, Rachel moved. Her shot was precise, hitting his shoulder rather than center mass, a deliberate choice to incapacitate rather than kill. He crumpled, the gun falling from his hand, as Reeves dove for cover. The remaining associates, seeing their plan collapse, began a desperate attempt to flee. One made it to the emergency exit before Rachel's shot caught him in the leg. Another surrendered immediately, dropping his weapon and raising his hands. The third fired wildly in Rachel's direction before she put him down with a shot to the arm. Within moments, what had been a coordinated escape attempt had devolved into chaos, but a chaos that Rachel controlled completely. She moved through the room with the confidence of someone navigating familiar territory, securing weapons, checking on the injured, ensuring no threat remained active. Only when she was certain the situation was contained did she allow herself to notice the pain from her bullet graze, the pounding of her heart, the torn blazer that had exposed her carefully guarded past. Harold Jenkins, the elderly clerk who had brought her coffee earlier, stared at her from his position under a table, his eyes wide with disbelief. Judge Wilson was similarly stunned, watching as her unremarkable court reporter transformed into something else entirely before her eyes. "Is everyone all right?" Rachel asked, scanning the room for injured civilians. A few nods, some whimpers, But miraculously, it appeared no bystanders had been hit in the exchange of gunfire. Rachel's precision had ensured that each shot calculated to neutralize threats without endangering innocence. The doors burst open again as police tactical units, alerted by the gunfire, flooded in with weapons drawn. They paused at the unexpected scene, armed men subdued on the floor, some wounded, a court stenographer with a torn blazer revealing military tattoos standing guard over them, weapon held with the confidence of someone who had trained with it extensively. Captain Coleman, United States Air Force. Rachel identified herself, lowering her weapon as the officers approached. The situation is contained. 7 hostiles, all neutralized, several with gunshot wounds requiring medical attention. The tactical team leader blinked in surprise, then nodded with professional respect. Yes, ma'am. As the police secured the gunmen and paramedics were called for the wounded, the reality of what had happened began to sink in for everyone who had witnessed it. The quiet stenographer, the woman who had sat in the corner for years recording their words without comment or notice, had revealed herself to be something else entirely. Rachel allowed a paramedic to examine the graze on her arm, though she knew it was minor. Just a scratch, she said, using the same word she had once used after a particularly harrowing mission over Iraq, when shrapnel from anti-aircraft fire had pierced her canopy. It needs cleaning and dressing, ma'am, the young paramedic insisted, clearly intimidated by her despite her civilian clothes. Rachel nodded, submitting to his ministrations while watching the police process the scene. Reeves and his associates were being cuffed and led away, their escape attempt having resulted only in adding several new charges to their already considerable legal troubles. The 3 masked gunmen were similarly secured, though they required medical attention first due to the injuries Rachel had inflicted. Judge Wilson, who had been evacuated from her chambers during the attack, returned to the courtroom with security personnel. Her eyes widened at the scene before her, especially when they fell on Rachel, who was now being examined by a paramedic despite her insistence that the bullet graze was minor. Miss Coleman, the judge said, approaching slowly. I had no idea. Rachel's smile was small but genuine. That was rather the point, Your Honor. 3 years you've worked in my courtroom, Judge Wilson continued, shaking her head in disbelief. All this time I've been asking if you needed bathroom breaks, or if the temperature was comfortable. And you've been, what, exactly? Special Forces? Air Force fighter pilot, ma'am. Rachel corrected gently. F-16s. The judge seemed to struggle with reconciling the quiet, efficient court reporter with the woman who had just single-handedly thwarted an armed escape attempt. But why? Why become a court stenographer after that? Rachel looked down at her hands that had once controlled supersonic aircraft, that had just neutralized 7 armed men, that spent most days now quietly recording the proceedings of justice. I just wanted to be a court reporter, she said quietly. Not a veteran, not a pilot, not a curiosity or an inspiration or whatever other label people want to apply. Just Rachel. The judge studied her for a long moment. Well, I'm afraid that ship has sailed. She gestured to the reporters already gathering outside the courtroom doors, the whispers spreading through the courthouse about what had happened. By tomorrow, everyone will know what you did here today. Rachel sighed, looking down at her torn blazer, the exposed tattoo and scars. The careful anonymity she had built over 4 years had been shredded as thoroughly as her clothing. There would be interviews, news stories, probably medals she didn't want. People would look at her differently now, not as the forgettable woman in the corner, but as something more complicated. As the paramedics finished bandaging her arm and the police completed taking her statement, Rachel found herself standing alone for a moment, contemplating what came next. Her phone was already filling with notifications, colleagues who had heard what happened, military friends who had recognized her name in early news reports. ADHN approached, still looking slightly shell-shocked. You saved a lot of lives today, he said, including mine. Rachel nodded, uncomfortable with the attention. Just did what needed doing. That's more than most people would have managed, Chen insisted. I've seen you every day for 3 years and never once suspected, well, never mind, thank you. Before Rachel could respond, Harold Jenkins approached, holding out a cardigan. For your, he gestured vaguely at her torn blazer. Thank you, Rachel said, slipping it on to cover herself. I just wanted to say, the clerk continued, his voice wavering slightly, my grandson is in the Air Force. He always talks about the pilots with such respect. I never imagined we had someone like you right here all along. Rachel nodded, unsure how to respond. This was exactly the kind of interaction she had sought to avoid. The reverence, the awe, the sense that she was somehow different from or better than others because of her military service. Thank you for what you did today, Jenkins finished. then shuffled away. More people approached, the bailiff, court security officers, even a judge from another courtroom who had heard what happened. Each wanted to express gratitude, to ask questions, to connect with the hero who had emerged from obscurity. Rachel answered politely but briefly, increasingly uncomfortable with the spotlight. Detective Rodriguez, who had been waiting to testify when the attack occurred, approached last. Unlike the others, he seemed to understand her discomfort. "Not big on attention, are you?" he asked quietly. Rachel gave him a grateful look. "No." The detective nodded. "My brother was a Marine. 2 tours in Iraq, came back different. Doesn't talk about it much." He studied her face. "You've got that same look?" "It's not something that translates well to civilian life," Rachel acknowledged. "No, it doesn't," Rodriguez agreed. "But sometimes it comes in handy, like today." He offered his hand. "Thank you." Rachel shook it, appreciating his understated approach. "Just doing my job." "That's the thing," he replied with a slight smile. "It wasn't your job, not anymore." He glanced around the courtroom, at the bullet holes in the woodwork, the blood stains on the floor. But maybe it still is, in a way. As Rodriguez walked away, Rachel considered his words. Was that true? Had she ever really stopped being Captain Coleman? Or had she just been hiding in plain sight as Rachel the court reporter? Judge Wilson approached again, this time with a more composed expression. "The Chief Judge has ordered the courthouse closed for the remainder of the day. We'll resume proceedings tomorrow." She hesitated, then added, "Will you be here to record them, Ms. Coleman? Or should I arrange for a replacement?" Rachel considered the question seriously. Her cover was blown. The comfortable anonymity was gone. Everyone would be staring, whispering, asking questions. The thought made her chest tighten with anxiety. And yet, the courtroom was her post now. She had accepted this assignment, this role. Walking away because it had become uncomfortable seemed counter to everything she had ever stood for. "I'll be here, Your Honor," she said finally. "I'm still a court reporter, regardless of what else I may have been." The judge nodded, something like respect flickering in her eyes. "Very well. I'll see you tomorrow then, Captain Coleman." "Just Rachel is fine, Your Honor," she said quietly. "Is it?" the judge asked with surprising insight. "Or is that the name you've been hiding behind?" Before Rachel could respond, the judge had moved away to confer with court security about arrangements for the following day. Left alone again, Rachel gathered her belongings and prepared to navigate the gauntlet of police, reporters, and curious onlookers outside. Her stenotype machine, the tool of her civilian identity, seemed strangely foreign now, as if it belonged to someone else. She packed it carefully nonetheless. As she stood to leave, she caught her reflection in the darkened computer screen on the judge's bench. Her hair was coming loose from its neat bun, strands falling around a face that seemed different somehow, sharper, more present. The borrowed cardigan covered her torn blazer, but she knew what lay beneath: the wings, the scars, the history she had tried to hide. Rachel Coleman had spent years trying to disappear into the role of an unremarkable court stenographer. But perhaps Rachel Coleman, court reporter and former fighter pilot, would find her own kind of peace in no longer having to hide. Outside the courthouse, television crews were already setting up, reporters preparing to broadcast the dramatic story of the firefight in courtroom 307. Rachel slipped out a side entrance, avoiding them for now. There would be time enough for that tomorrow. She drove home in silence, her mind replaying the events of the day, not with the trauma she might have expected, but with the cool analytical precision of a pilot debriefing after a mission. Entry points, threat assessment, neutralization tactics. She had executed everything by the book, as if she had never left the military at all. Her apartment was small but neat, decorated sparsely with a few landscape photographs and bookshelves filled with legal texts and aviation histories. It was a space caught between two worlds, neither fully civilian nor military, much like Rachel herself. She showered, washing away the sweat and gunpowder residue, careful with the bandage on her arm. Then she opened the closet, pushed aside her court attire, and reached for the box at the back, the one she rarely touched. Inside lay her dress blues, perfectly pressed despite years of disuse. Her medals were arranged in precise rows: the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star with Valor, the Air Medal with multiple oak leaf clusters, the Combat Action Medal, and others. Beneath them, wrapped in soft cloth, was her set of pilot's wings, the original ones, not the tattoo that had revealed her identity today. Rachel ran her fingers over the metal wings, feeling the weight of them, the literal weight in her hand, and the metaphorical weight they carried. She had earned these through years of training, sacrifice, and service. They represented a part of herself she had tried to lock away, thinking it didn't belong in her new life. But today had proven otherwise. Today, Captain Rachel Coleman had saved lives because of her training, her experience, her willingness to act when others could not. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Mitchell USAF, Colonel James Mitchell, her former commanding officer and one of the few military contacts she had maintained. Coleman, she answered, falling automatically into her old way of identifying herself. Just saw you on the news, Phantom, Mitchell said, using her old call sign. Courthouse shooting, hostage situation, former stenographer revealed as Air Force hero. That about sum it up? Despite everything, Rachel found herself smiling. The media's exaggerating again, sir. 7 hostiles neutralized without civilian casualties? Sounds like an accurate assessment to me. There was a pause. You okay, Rachel? The question caught her off guard. Not because of its content, but because of the genuine concern behind it. I'm fine, sir, just a graze. That's not what I meant. Rachel sighed, understanding. Cover's blown. 4 years of being invisible, gone in a second. Maybe that's not a bad thing, Mitchell suggested. You've been hiding long enough, don't you think? I wasn't hiding, she protested. I was adapting to civilian life. By pretending to be someone you're not? Rachel had no immediate response to that. Had she been pretending? Or had she simply been trying to find a version of herself that could exist peacefully in a world that didn't require constant vigilance and split-second decisions? The Air Force could use you back, you know, Mitchell said after a moment. Not necessarily in the cockpit. Training, strategy, leadership, your medical discharge isn't set in stone. It was an offer she had heard before and declined. Flying had been her passion, her purpose. Anything else had seemed like a consolation prize. I'll think about it, she said, surprising herself with the realization that she meant it. Do that, Mitchell replied. And Rachel, what you did today, it's who you are. It's who you've always been. Maybe it's time to stop running from that. After they hung up, Rachel sat on the edge of her bed, the box of military mementos open beside her. She picked up a photograph she hadn't looked at in years, herself and her squadron mates standing in front of their F-16s, smiling with the confident camaraderie of those who trust each other with their lives. Lieutenant Daniels and Captain Williams were there, forever young in the frozen moment before the attack that would claim their lives. Rachel traced their faces with her finger, feeling the familiar weight of survivors' guilt, but also something else, a recognition that she had honored their memory today by using the skills they had all shared to protect the innocent. Judge Wilson's question echoed in her mind. Is it, or is that the name you've been hiding behind? Perhaps the judge had seen more clearly than Rachel herself. Perhaps just Rachel had indeed been a hiding place rather than an identity, a way to blend in, to avoid the complications of being Captain Coleman with all the expectations and attention that came with it. But today had shattered that distinction. Today, Rachel Coleman and Captain Coleman had been one and the same person, the court stenographer who noticed details others missed, and the combat pilot who acted decisively in a crisis. As she prepared for bed, Rachel made a decision. Tomorrow she would return to Courtroom 307. She would face the stares, the questions, the changed perceptions. She would continue to record the proceedings with the same precision and professionalism she always had. But she would no longer pretend to be less than she was. The wings tattooed over her heart were as much a part of her as the stenotype machine she operated. The combat-honed instincts that had saved lives today were as integral to her being as her skill at transcribing testimony. Rachel Coleman had spent years trying to disappear into the role of an unremarkable court stenographer. But perhaps Rachel Coleman, court reporter and former fighter pilot, would find her own kind of peace in no longer having to hide. As she drifted towards sleep, her mind returned to the moment when her blazer had torn, revealing the wings beneath. In that instant of exposure, of vulnerability, she had found a strange kind of freedom, the freedom to be fully herself without apology or explanation. Maybe that was worth more than the comfort of invisibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attention she had spent years avoiding, but it would also bring something she hadn't allowed herself in a long time, the chance to integrate all parts of herself into a whole person, neither defined solely by her military past, nor constrained by her civilian present. Captain Rachel Phantom Coleman and Rachel the court reporter were the same person after all. And perhaps it was time the world and Rachel herself recognized that truth. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where people completely underestimated your abilities or your past? Were you ever revealed to be much more than others assumed? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and your experience might inspire our next video. And if you want to make sure you don't miss our future stories of hidden heroes, hit that subscribe button right now.